starting very shortly. I'm going to admit everyone in. Once we've admitted everyone in, we're expecting at least 40 to 50 people here. We've got about 100 people registered or so. So I expect around 40 to 50 people to actually come in. So just give me a couple of minutes as you'll come in. I have to admit everyone. Just some housekeeping rules as you come in. If you don't mind, brothers and sisters, number one, please keep your phones or your devices, PCs, Macs, whatever you're using to watch the Zoom on mute, number one. Number two, this is, if you haven't registered, leave your email address with us so we can send you the link of the recording. Number three, we are taking questions. We will be taking questions from the chat as well as directly. That's not a problem. We'll be doing that as well. So very important, put your questions on the chat and the professor or myself will selectively choose which questions will be answered. I mean, most questions will be answered anyway. Just waiting for a few more people just to log in. Do forward the link to other friends or families or academics or activists or thinkers you think will benefit from this. It's an exclusive. We haven't had Professor Farid for a long time, or if not, so it's a very intense and intellectual discussion we're going to have with him. So just admit everyone. Can I just remind everyone as you come in, please keep your Zooms on mute before we're going to start in the next minute or two. Okay. I think we can start. Right. Okay. So can I get Professor back on? Professor Esack, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Very much.
Okay. Very good. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to our Zoom session. We're very honored and privileged to have our dear teacher and Ustad, Professor Farid Esack from the University of Johannesburg, all the way down from South Africa. We're in London and he's in South Africa. Amazing, huh? What amazing things technology can do. Right, so the topic today is going to be on Quran, liberation and theology. And our speaker today, as I said, is Professor Esack, who is originally from South Africa. He's a Muslim theologian, okay? Who cut his teeth in the South African struggle for liberation. He studied in Pakistan at Jamia Binuri, Darul Uloom, and the UK, where he got his PhD in Germany, and is the author of many books, in particular the Quran Liberation Pluralism book on being Muslim, an introduction to the Quran, Islam, HIV and AIDS, gender liberation, theology, interfaith, etc. Professor Esack is served as a commissioner for gender equality, South African, and has taught at the University of Western Cape and Hamburg and Union Theological Seminary in New York and other places. Before moving to the University of Johannesburg, where he is professor in the study of Islam and the head of Department of Religious Study, he served as professor of contemporary Islam at Harvard and currently professor emeritus at the International Quranic Studies Association and chairperson of the Boycott, Disinvestment Sanctions, BDS, South Africa. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Jazakallah khair, and I'm delighted to be with you.
Welcome, thank you. Ramadan Kareem to you. We hope that your Ramadan is going to be of great benefit. Allah accept our fast, forgive our sins, and of the Ummah. And inshallah, we hope that you pray and remember us in your fast and you're breaking your fast as well, and prayers. Okay, so the format, what we're going to do, before I'm going to hand it over to yourself, I'm going to ask you to present on the topic for about 20 minutes, and thereafter that we will take questions and answers from the chat or from directly from Zoom. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it to yourself, inshallah. Bismillah.
Okay, assalamu alaikum everybody. I'm really delighted to be with people. I see a number of names that I recognize. Feel slightly awkward because many of you may have heard me before. Yeah, but there is this things in the Quran, you know, وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ ذِكْرَ تَنْفَعُهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And remind, for indeed a reminder benefits the believers. So I'll be chatting to you today about some of the notions connected to theology and to liberation and the Quran. Many of you will know that I have a bit of a reputation, I think. I'm not sure whether it is a dubious one or enviable one, or but a bit of a reputation. for being engaged in or struggling to deal with the question of Islamic liberation theology. Now, there is a quote there that's an anagram that I start with, because we often, I mean, increasingly, I think it's becoming acceptable amongst many, many people, admittedly or not, where they also kind of describe their own theologies. People speak about traditional Islam, or people speak about, or they say, I'm, you know, I'm in a Sufi tariqa, or no, I follow the Salaf as-Salih. They won't necessarily say that I'm a Salafi, but increasingly people are beginning to come to terms with, there are some adjectives, for example, that are still kind of really, people don't like. Terms like fundamentalist or modernist or those kinds of terms. So there's a statement by Ali Shariati very quickly that in some ways is explicit about this. Now, of course, he puts it in very binary terms, the Islam of Abu Dharr and the Islam of Marwan. One is the Islam of the Caliphate, of the palace and of the rulers. The other is the Islam of the people, the exploited and of the poor. Perhaps he puts it in far too stark terms. There may be nuances in between, but in many ways, this is what a liberatory approach to the Quran is, a struggle all the time to look at the Quran through the lenses of the marginalized, and a continuous interrogation of what the marginalized mean and to what extent the understandings of marginalized is compatible or fits in with the Quranic understanding of it. The same goes for the question of liberation, which I will come to later on. Now, the second point that I want to make on the second slide is liberation theology. It's not an ideology. It's not a definitive set of ideas and beliefs with a well carved out, this is the package. And you
Professor, do you want me to share the slides now?
Yes, of course. Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Sure. So I'll just
we're on the second slide now. You can quickly show the first slide.
Yep, just going to get that for you. I'll have to give me a couple of minutes. If you just continue, and I'll get that.
That's fine. So, liberation theology, it's not, there are some attempts, or at least one particular attempt by somebody based, I think, in Australia, to ideologize liberation theology and turn it into a particular set of ideas, a set of beliefs, which has these kind of fundamental pillars to it. Nearly ideologize things, and in the same way, I think, which very many other traditional theologies try to do. They write everything out and they give you this package, and you either take the whole package or you leave it. But it is a predetermined bundle of ideas, and often well thought out, sometimes not so well thought out, based and littered with a whole lot of Quranic texts and so on. So it is not an ideology. That's the first thing that it. The second thing is that, what is it then? It's a critique. It's a critique of traditional theology, of the way Muslims generally do theology, but it's a critique done in tandem with our context, where we are at the moment. It's approach to the Quran, it's an approach to Islam, but it's an approach that is shaped by a very definitive perspective. It's what are the glasses that you have on before you're reading this and seeing a green text in front of you, or a blue text, or a yellow or a purple text. What are the glasses that you have? So it is a kind of a grappling with the glasses. But it's also, while you're grappling with looking at your text through your glasses, it's also an attempt to figure out where am I going? And how do I move, and I'll come back to this in a short while, moving ever closer to a core. There is a core, and this core could be al-haq. This core could be your ultimate end. I mean, in the Quran, for example, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is asked to fa'budu rabbaka hatta ataka al-yaqeen, to serve your God, your Lord, until certainty comes to you. And so it's a closer approach to al-yaqeen, to yaqeen, But this certainty really only terminates with death. If you had interpreted that ayah in a literal sense, then you would have said, فَعْبُدُ رَبَّكَ, if you have to worship your God, حَتَّى أَتَاكَ الْيَقِينَ, until you attain unto certainty. So the Prophet was certain about the existence of God. He was certain about who he was dealing with. But it doesn't mean that when he had now reached certainty that he should stop worshipping God. The Quran says, حَتَّى أَتَاكَ الْيَقِينَ. Yani, in this particular case, the yaqeen refers to death. And so in some ways, absolute certainty is just a struggle that we move towards. Later on, I will come to this, what we describe as the hermeneutical circles. We're on to the third screen, and I'm sure that, onto the third screen, you can see me, I'm sure, and you can see the screen. On the third screen there, we have a bit of a clearer idea of just one second, I've lost my balance here. There. So, like this moment, I'm starting right at the bottom of the screen, starting at the top. At the moment, I mean, our whole world is going through, in some ways, through a kind of a crisis. In some ways, it's only reflective of a larger crisis, the COVID-19 and Muslim debates around, for example, the opening of mosques. Now, generally, periods of heightened social ferment, as is this period, particularly in stratified societies, you find that there are frenetic, serious ideological contestations. And even now, I mean, if you, for example, look at India, and you see at India, or you look at Israel, and you look at the United States, you see how these contestations around a particular crisis, it is also seized and utilized by the dominant classes to contain and to incorporate thought and human behavior within a predetermined framework. Of course, in India, you've got the framework of Hindutva. In Israel, you've got the framework of Zionism. And how do we now use this COVID thing to further marginalize the Dalits, in India, to further engage in to formalize the repression of Muslims? You see this in Israel, you see this so dominant classes through these crises always struggle to advance their own interests. And in the middle of this, the subalterns, the oppressed people, the marginalized, they struggle to, how do we further or maintain, or how do we further the validity of our own realities? People, COVID affects all of humankind, but no, it affects Black people in a very different way than what it affects white people. It affects the underclasses, the subalterns. It affects the people in the ghettos in a very different way. So you can't only speak about a Muslim response to COVID. And the contestations in South Africa, for example, around the debates around the opening of the mosques in all of this, often in loaded language. These people are sellouts if they say that the mosque should be closed or moderate, progressive, blah, blah, blah. And of course, other more normative terms, this is moral Islam, this is a more responsible attitude to adopt, this is the decent thing to do, or of course, this is the moderate thing that Islam is really all about. Now, if you look at COVID very, very quickly, then, I mean, at the moment, there's as much of this talk around the flattening the curve. We've got to be all engaged in lockdown, stay away, social distancing, in order. But wait, there is another element to this, and that is on the next screen. There is this whole thing about flattening the curve. But the larger problem that all of us are facing, I mean, if you look at the bailouts that countries in the global north, in the UK and in the United States, the bailouts that they are now offering to the bigger companies, of course, they threw a bit of the sweet to the ordinary population also by this $1,200 flat things per person. But the people who are really going to benefit from all of this, It is the larger corporates in these countries. And in the middle of this, there is a larger contestation. So hey guys, it is about my health. It is about my keeping social distance, my wearing a mask, my not going out, and. But there is a larger problem. The curve that is damaging the earth. So there's this rush around the current health crisis without any concern for how do our responses to the current health crisis, how does it also build in a larger resourcefulness, a larger seriousness about life and the nature of life on the earth, but also with our fellow inhabitants of the earth. So that kind of graph shows you, I didn't realize this. I thought it was just about, do you keep mosques open? Do you keep mosques closed? And then is it permissible do the shoulders have to touch each other? How do we manage Ramadan? There are issues far more that contains not just the so in one way, I don't mean narrow-minded, but if you have a very limited look on this, you look at this whole thing through an entirely fiqh thing, you resort to your madhaib thing, and what was there? Okay, here we found this hadith, sallu fi buyutikum. The Prophet saying, pray. Okay, great, now we found it. Now, okay, we can pray in our houses. Okay. And there are other people who resort to a much more, how can we guys organize, mobilize, feed schemes for the poor, and so on. And in the middle of this, we also ask to wait, what's the longer thing? Is there an opportunity inside this for us to go beyond all of this? And so in liberation theology, we talk about the hermeneutical circle, and I'm now onto my fifth slide. We talk about the hermeneutical circle, and I will use this as a way of delving into the question of the Quran and theology and the question of liberation. So in the beginning, I said that there isn't a nas. Well, of course, for Muslims, there is a nas. I'm talking about liberation theology now. But that our ideas are continuously being reshaped by liberative praxis. Now, in some ways, there is an affinity, much of an affinity, to the thought of liberation theology and to the methodology of tasawwuf or irfan, where you don't enter, you enter as a salik, you enter as a traveler, and the journey is as important as the direction. But whether you are, and the journey, there's the direction, but there's also the qasd or the ghard, the objective, the purpose of where you are going to. In liberation theology, it is clear, all affairs return to Allah, wa ilallahi turja'u al-umur, wa ilayhi al-masir. So there is this moving towards God all the time. But this movement towards God, it's circumambular. You move in a circle, and there are processes inside this circle. And you don't say when you are a salik, you are a traveler. You don't say, I have found the answers. So, okay, I'll come back to the idea that there are answers, but in some ways you leave the shirk of saying, I have found all the answers. Some of the impulses in liberation theology are universal. The one is to identify with the marginalized. The second is to revolt against injustice. And the third is to be suspicious of hegemonic paradigms. The answers are never absolute. When you consider yourself a salik, the answers are never absolute, only the transcendent is. But the outcomes, the answers that you get, they are the outcomes of reflection on your a'mal. What have I done? How have I acted? How have I read the Quran in relation to what I'm doing? How am I pulled back by the Quran into one direction? And how do I use the Quran at another level to draw water from, to drink, as I move on into the next part of my journey? So the Quran, in many ways, is your anchor. Not the Quran as a text to be worshipped, but the Quran as a reflection of the transcendent of Allah speaking. of Allah having spoken then, but also of Allah speaking to you as a believer and as a salik now. So wait. Can you pause for a moment? Okay, fine, go ahead. Okay, wait, you are thirsty now, stop, drink, move ahead. And you come back and you check again with your methodological map, which is, of course, the Quran. But you know that your journeying is one towards God, but that this God has a particular obsession. He has a particular obsession with anas, humankind. That's something that I'm rethinking as I'm talking to you now, because the whole idea of humankind as the center of the universe that is being seriously challenged by ecofemicide, by ecocide, our destruction of the universe. But that this praxis, this journeying towards God, is done in solidarity with the people that in different ways God has expressed his own solidarity with. So there in the next screen is a quick listings of the hermeneutical circle. You ask, Ish, what's going on here? You've observed injustice, zulm, and then you, think through it, reflect on the situation, and then you ask, Ish, how did these people get away with it? They've persuaded people all these years that there is no alternative for them but to live on the edges. This is, this is the will of God, that people be oppressed. This is the will of God, that people be poor. In fact, we speak about the poor. The poor will always be with us. Should we be doing anything about this? If God had wanted, move around in that circle, but at the bottom on the right-hand side, you see the theological question. What sort of a God do I believe in when I accept what they say? They say that poverty is in the destiny of some people. They say that as-sultan dhillullah fil ard, that the sultan is the shadow of God on the earth. وَمَنْ أَهَانَ السُّلْطَانَ فَقَدْ أَهَانَهُ اللَّهُ. Whoever has insulted the sultan, God will insult him. Oh, what kind of God is this that I'm worshipping? So it is a seriously theological question. With this theological question, you go to the Quran and you look at it and the demands of the demands, what does the Quran and the Sunnah demand of you? And in this way, you find a different way of looking at the entire Quran, because you're sitting with an issue of needing to address injustice. So you act on your new understanding. So truth, there is an al-haq. There is the question of al-yaqeen, and there is a question of yaqeen. And the truth Muslims believe exists. The truth is absolute. Okay. But for me, as a believer, engaged in the Quran, engaged in the issues of the margins of society, I can't speak about, for me, in how I speak and articulate it. I can't speak in terms of an absolute truth. Only dimensions of layers of this truth are knowable. And of course, traditional Islam and modern scholarship both acknowledge it. The difference in liberation theology is that this truth doesn't prove eternal truths. It doesn't aim to, but it is to reflect on the existential truth that is disclosed through history. So liberation theology helps to create a truth, because theological reasoning is uttered upon a truth that is away upon a word, and here this Rebecca Chop, she uses very Christian language, and one of you can raise the question of my borrowing from Christian language later, a word. And for us, of course, it is the Quran that has pitched tent in the midst of history. Yeah, let me move on to just clarifying what I mean by liberation. And I skipped 2 slides now, and I'm on the 10th slide. For me, liberation is a process of ever deepening freedom from the exploitation and injustice of individuals and groups. And here I may want to add systems, individuals, groups, and systems, by others and the nafs. And so there is a question of jihadun nafs. There is a question of dhulmun nafs. You know, in dhalamtu nafsi, I have wronged myself. So it's a combination of both. You may say that at some stage you can say, you know, you've attained liberation, like South Africa was liberated from apartheid, or you can say, I've been liberated from this kind of ignorance. But all of these liberations, in many ways, also contain germs of oppression inside them. So you've just gotten your sanad as an alim, and or you just have gotten your sanad as a PhD, and now I have been liberated from a certain kind of jahl. Okay, I've been liberated from a certain kind of jahl, and I now enter another period of dhulmun nafs, of takabbur, of ghurur, of arrogance, of self-righteousness, because I'm now an alim, I'm a Maulana, I know the truth, I'm a somebody, you are nothing, I'm chosen, you are frozen. So all forms of liberation, even when I look at South Africa has been in many ways liberated from apartheid, and now it has assumed this arrogance towards the rest of Africa, and I mean xenophobia, the hatred, not xenophobia as such, but the disdain for Black Africans or foreigners who are darker skinned. It's a frightening thing in South Africa. So in many ways, all forms of liberation also contain within themselves the germs for further oppressions. And this is why the idea of reflection, of dhulmun nafs, must be combined with any systemic critique of socio-economic injustices. So there in the last paragraph, we constantly become aware of deeper layers of oppression and prejudice, our own complicity in them, and we experience how earlier, more obvious forms of injustices, they morph into new ones. And of course, I mean, the ability of the powerful, they present illusionary victories to us. They name their streets Malcolm X Boulevard, and then we think that there's now, okay, fine. So Malcolm X has now become an icon, so fine, the civil rights things, the struggle for justice. No, these are things that they do as ways of manipulating the underclasses and preventing rebellions. As for theology, of course, transcendent, theo, it's about God, the transcendent. It is about God. However, theology is not only about God. The fact that theology is not only about God doesn't make it less authentic. You know, many of the traditionalists would want to argue that ilmul kalam, well, in the way, I mean, their interpretation or translation of theology as kalam, it's only about God. No, theology is also about people, socially and historically located beings. And when you say theology is only about God, and you don't want to engage in your own location in this discussion about God, you don't want to engage in your whiteness as a white Muslim theologian. You don't want to engage in your maleness as a male theologian. Wait. What you're really doing, you are denying, and knowingly or unknowingly, but invariably and inevitably, you are actually displaying the hegemonic discourse embedded in your understanding of theology. So liberation theology tries to approach the Quran from the underside of history. It's an attempt to retrieve religious authenticity from the powerful, to free it from the idea that is irrevocably tied to the powerful. No, it's not about the powerful. Right. I'm on my third last things. So this is a bit of a slogan of mine. I'm happy to repeat it all the time. that much of contemporary theology, even contemporary Muslim modernist theology, much of the debate in the Muslim West is how do we fit in with the system? How do we fit in with power? This is this borders on the heresy, because there isn't a single prophet in Islam, whoever came into this world and who made this the fundamental question: how do I fit in with power? So the moving impulse driving liberation is a desperation for justice, a determination for freedom from all forms of oppression. And I spoke about the different kinds in the beginning. An end to the exploitation of one person by another, the abuse of power that have always been evident in many forms of Islam and in history. In fact, the very emergence of Islam itself may be seen as revolt against oppression and injustice. You know, I'd really want to recommend to the viewers this wonderful book written a number of years ago, I think about 25 years ago, by Michael Seltz on the shorter Meccan surahs, Understanding the Quran. Just an amazing reflection on how all the earlier Meccan surahs that ostensibly deal only with akhirah and matters of aqidah, how it also reflects the desperation of a transcendent, of a God, to shake people and to shake the existing power structures and the capricious, the underlying desperation or desire for wealth. So it is a theology that is shaped in praxis. The Quran talks about this, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا, that those who are striving towards us, to them we shall show the way. So in many ways, it is a manhaj, but it is also it is a path, as I said in the beginning, and let me not spend. Okay, so I need to wind up. So the appropriate context, and I'm on my last slide now, the appropriate context of liberation theology, it is always the marginalized, the oppressed, the undersides of history, the subaltern, and the periphery. And this is why you are engaged in your own constant battles with yourself and the acknowledgement of your own demons. And when I say demons, I don't only mean by the things that are troubling you, the things that are vexing you. I'm also talking about the shaitans inside us, the Fir'auns, the impulse. You know, many people, I mean, even in the apartheid South Africa, and we see in South Africa this happening now, our initial struggle was one for liberation. And then after that, no, our struggle is we want to be like these white people were. We want to live like these white people were. We want to have as much money as what these. This is not what the Quran calls us to. And so all of us, we are located, it's not just a struggle of the global north and the global south. It is that. But each of us have our own global norths in our hearts, or global north impulses. And all of us need to struggle to move closer and closer to the global south. So the significant thing is to be alert to our changing contexts and to engage in a relentless struggle to see the world and the Quran through the eyes and the urgencies of the marginalized. And I want to end on this really problematic note. When we deny the power of whiteness, or maleness, or otherness, or the power of your own caste location, all of this leads to the modernist myth of objectivity on the one hand, and on the other hand, it leads to the traditionalist myth that there is an essential truth that can be applied to all situations, and in the ignoring of this, they often walk the path of alongside, in many cases, well, regrettably, they walk the path, or they walk along, or they walk as the supporting cast for Fir'aun and Haman. Let me conclude on that. I've gone slightly over the time, but yeah, here we go.
Thank you so much, Professor. Fantastic presentation. Just to remind anyone who's come in now, can you please, unless you want to ask a question, please put your systems on mute. It is being recorded, so you will, if you haven't registered, you will receive. Please let us have your email address on the chat, and we'll send you a copy. And those who have registered will get it. So we're going to start the Q&A question. So you can ask questions on the chat, or you can put up your hand on the thing. I want to start off with some questions or some comments who've come through about since your book, which was written nearly 23 years ago or so, 25. You wrote in a particular time, and the traditional ulama at that time were very angry with your universalist theology, okay? Because obviously you've been working with different folks like from the Christian community, and because at the end of the time you were against apartheid and so on. So do you feel that has affected your epistemology, your methodology? And where do you think liberation theology is going right now? If you can see, we can see liberation theology. I mean, liberalism is now on its toes, complete with the rise of neo-nationalism, and so. Yeah. So if we can start off with those two questions, maybe perhaps, and then if people have got questions on the chat, please don't hesitate, and also we can take questions directly from the Zoom as well. Bismillah.
Okay. Okay, fine.
So, for example, Timothy Winter's criticism of your book,
yes,
that
yes,
you
yes.
have no method, you don't have a traditional methodology, you are a Rahmanian sort of prodigy, and hence, your way of doing things is not. But the irony is, the neo-traditionalists are now the dhalims, so, maybe you can comment on reflection. So you were written in a time where the dictators were, we were all against the dictators. Now, the very people who are the dictators seems to be in bed with the traditionalists. Maybe you can.
Yes. Well, first of all, it was kind of very amusing for me, this Abdul Hakim Murad or Timothy Winter's critique. Very often when people looked up me or when they looked up the text, the first thing that they came across was his review. And I must think it's remarkable that a review of a book has lasted and has kind of, in fact, sometimes, more people have read the review of the book than what they've read the book itself. I wasn't particularly bothered or impacted by this at all, because the traditional ulama, with all my due respect for their knowledge and so on, and the traditional scholars, they very rarely, if ever, had anything serious to say about the major crises in our world. One of the senior traditional scholars, you may have mentioned his name or you may not, I'm not going to care to mention his name. When I was engaged in writing this work on Islam, HIV and AIDS, a pandemic that had ravaged Africa, left villages completely obliterated, a huge pandemic facing humankind, particularly our continents that had seen millions of lives being taken. I wrote to a number of them and I was very keen to know what is the traditional perspective on this. And with lots of respect and affection, not affection so much, but with a lot of respect, many of them responded to say that, look, I'm sorry, we don't have anything to say about this. We don't know, we don't. So during the time, whether it was a struggle against apartheid, whether it is the struggle for the right of the Dalits in India, whether it is the struggle of liberation of the Palestinians, by and large, these aren't questions that traditionalists take seriously. And when they do enter the fray, they often enter the fray on the side of white supremacy. They often enter the fray on the side of Arab monarchies. So I was never particularly bothered by the critiques, and I say this with some humility.
You don't think that sort of framing is sort of a Marxist framing? There's nothing Islamic inherent in your framing. Their criticism is that you don't have a traditional usul and in your framing of things because of the way you're just angry reacting to what's there.
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't know, this, what they call this traditional framing. Inside this traditional framing, what should I have resorted to a Mu'tazili framing? Should I have engaged to a Maturidi framing? What do they mean by this kind of just invoking a couple of European classical scholars or invoking a couple of, my own firm background is in Ulum al-Quran and in Tafsir. And I frame by these things in terms of Ulum al-Quran and in terms of tafsir. But if they want me to, there's not much that I can do about it. The truth is that their framings are also being adapted constantly. One of the leading traditional scholars in the United States, until 9/11 struck, his line was an Islamic state in the United States. And he's flipped immediately after 9/11, touted himself as an advisor to George Bush. And in my company, well, he didn't know that I was overhearing him, but in a TV studio, he actually told another traditional colleague. This was on 60 Minutes in I think CBC or one of these US stations. And we were in the studio, he told another, this thing's a bit of a soft tone, misjudged my hearing capacity, and that, what can we do? We just have to change tack. So, so traditionalism is far more of an instrument for many of the proclaimed traditionalists. It's far more of an instrument to justify their own dominant theologies at a particular moment. So I'm happy to, if traditionalism is to become synonymous with monarchies and to become synonymous with, Sultan Dhillullah fil Ard, then I'm happy to not be following a traditional path. But
sure. So then looking at liberalism now,
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Islam. Yes, Maulana Sajjad from Deoband, please, if you'd like to ask a question. So we have Maulana Sajjad.
I'm very thankful for your kind speech, and it was really very fantastic speech. I heard it, I listened it, I utilized a lot, and I came to know the broad aspect of your thinking. You were saying that the traditional ulama, they are far behind to address the new issues arising in the world. But I see that without sticking to the traditional texts and the injunctions given by the predecessors, we cannot do anything. So all the rules and all the principles, we are stemming out from the rules given by our traditional ulama. How would you respond to it?
Maulana, मैंने कभी उलमा के लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल नहीं किया था. I never used the word ulama, okay? So,
no, but I think you mean the traditional ulama means the scholars who are teaching in madaris or who are following the principles that you are discussing some minutes before.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. In some ways, that crowd that you are referring to, yes, they are also regarded as the, but when Mizan addressed the question, he did not really refer to the traditional ulama as in, say, the Deobandi school or the Barelvis that wasn't his reference. His reference was to a particular group of people that identify as traditionalists.
So how you can define the traditional ulama or traditional scholars? What would be the absolute definition of this term? Whom do you term traditional ulama?
Okay.
Who they are? What their activities?
Okay, fine.
Sure. Okay, so if Sajjad, Maulana Sajjad, if you let the professor respond, and then we'll continue, inshallah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
First of all, I mean, traditionalism is generally viewed as that perspective where you see the past as your anchor and the ideal place to return to. So that's the typical view of traditionalism. And in the Muslim discourse, in the contemporary Muslim discourse, it is often used in two different kinds of ways. The one is to just refer to the ulama in general, who've come from different, say, Diyar al-Ulum or Al-Azhar, or to refer to them. And the other sense is to refer to a group of scholars, largely based in the West, who are invoking traditionalism in contemporary issues. And these include the likes of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, of Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad, of Professor Syed Hussein Nasser. There's a whole host of some of these people. And I think that when the question was asked to me, it was asked in the context of the second group of people and not the first group of people. But there is generally a claim that there is an ideal past that all of us must go through. In my own work, I always acknowledge this past. I work through this past. I work through the tafsir tradition and through the sunnah. I do, I think, I mean, for better or for worse, I am familiar with the traditional. And this is, and to come back quickly to the question that Mizan had now raised, or wanted to raise before your question came in, this is different from the path of liberalism. And liberalism is essentially accountable to the fetishization of the individual, where an individual can do what he wants to do, can be what he or she wants to be, he or she or it wants to be, and there's only an individual conscience, and everything about our past, our tradition must be turned upside down, inside out, in order to fit in with modernity or to fit in with the worship of the self.
So you don't think they're cut from the same tree?
Absolutely not.
Right. Just to clarify that, because obviously that was one of your critiques.
I distance myself from modernism, and I distance myself from liberalism. هذا فراق بيني وبينك. This is where I part company with that crowd.
Thank you. I think we got some questions. Maulana Sajjad, is that okay? Was that acceptable response?
No, the response is not satisfactory. I'm not satisfied with the response.
Okay, sure. Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to you. We've just got another one question, and I'm going to come back to you. If that's okay.
But now after 5 minutes, I will lead Sarawi, so I would not get. Inshallah, I will talk to the professor individually. If I will get his personal email address or any contact number, definitely I'll be pleased to listen to him, to know his views, his thoughts. And definitely we will try to rectify ourselves. If we have mistakes, we correct it.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. That was Maulana Sajjad from India, Deoband Qasmi Sab. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a question here on the chat from Hasim. He says, from Islamic history, do we have approaches similar to liberation theology, though not necessarily the same from time to time, that rebelled against established traditions, beliefs from the side of the oppressed? Can we benefit from that history? What are the books and available to study from?
Okay, well, firstly, it's a long, we have individuals, and then there are also movements that represent something of the liberatory impulse. One would argue, and again, if I quickly just mention again, the Michael Sells book. The Michael Sells book, in fact, shows you, the Michael Sells Approaching the Quran, really is a clear suggestion that, oops, the whole prophetic movement was a rebellion. ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر. You kind of gather, you accumulating, أيحسب أن لم يروا أحدا. They think that nobody sees what they're doing. So the entire, especially the early part of the Prophet's life, was a rebellion. It was a struggle to establish a more just society. The second thing is, of course, you have individuals. I mean, the uprising of Imam Hussein against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, contentious as they may be in theology. Now, Islam isn't only, and this is where I part company with many of the Qur'anists, where they say, just look at the Qur'an. No. Islam is also our tradition. And so, yes, there are other individuals other than inside the contestation inside early Islam. The question of Abu Dharr al-Ghifari and the Prophet's commendation of Abu Dhar al-Ghifari. And inside, I mean, more contemporary Imam Shamil, Imam Shamil of Chechnya, the question of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in Pakhtunkhwa. If you want to extend tradition, and I'm not quite sure when traditionalists insist on tradition, where they actually draw the line. Because
do you think you misunderstood when you saying certain hadiths you had, because back in the time that one of the critiques was that your approach to hadith, or you couldn't, there were certain issues surrounding the understanding of yourselves with hadiths. Could you clarify that? Because that was part of your methodology, and because the question is that you're taking a lot of from Christian philosophy and theology and making into, you're Islamizing Christian theology. That was the issue.
Well, if you want to talk about Islamizing this or Islamizing that, if you look at a new concept amongst very many Muslims, the concept of, say, wasatiyya, of moderation. It's grabbing one term inside the Quran, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا إِلَى آخِرِ الْآيَةِ. It's grabbing one term in the Quran, turning it into a whole distinct approach to, now look, people, throughout Islamic history, in Islamic philosophy, Muslims have always, whether you want to describe it as borrowing or describe it as being enriched, there's always been this things inside Islamic history. Islam did not arise in a vacuum. The fact that in Safa and Marwa was retained, despite what the Mushrikun had done to Safa and Marwa. So the same goes for Islamic philosophy, Islamic theology. All of this had been tainted by other streams. Liberation theology owns this contamination, but insists that this contamination be through the eyes of the marginalized. We're not particularly interested in Christianity or particularly interested in Judaism. There isn't, in fact, other scholars are far more interested in Christian, in their own works. I'm talking about these traditional scholars. They're far more interested in Western philosophy, these traditional scholars, than what I've ever indicated in any of my work.
Right. Okay, we've got a question. Just hold on. Someone has raised their hand. Saif. Go ahead, Saif. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor. Thank you for your sort of presentation. It's really, really enlightening. Thank you for that. I just want to ask you, how would a liberation theologian or someone who subscribes perhaps to liberation theology flesh out some sort of familiar theological loci? Like, let's take the idea of God or the idea of a prophet. How would a liberation theologian, what's different about their perspective on, say, God? I mean, does God deliver the oppressed and the poor as part of, his providential plan of history? I mean, how do they conceive or reconceive these sort of theological ideas? So whether the God, prophet, role of the Sahaba, sort of, the staple features of the Islamic tradition. Is there an example you can give, perhaps?
Okay. Sorry, I mean, I just heard Mizan calling it Saif now. I'm also.
Oh, Saf. Yeah, Saf is fine. Yeah, Professor. That's.
No, okay. Okay. First of all, there isn't, in none of the people who've written about liberation theology or in the areas where it is discussed, there isn't really a sophisticated, a nuanced discussion going on about God as is discussed in the usual theological circles. However, there is a clear sense that this is a God, and this in many ways, you may say that they are now privileging. By the way, I know that we are living in different worlds, but it is time for me to break my fast. And it would have been quicker to go for a date with the Sunnah, but it was easier to just reach for the milk. But there is a certainty that God is the deliverer, and that God responds to the cries of the oppressed. And you find lots of hadith in this. You find this in the Quran as well. But there isn't a demand that God must respond now. There isn't a demand that if God doesn't respond, God hasn't heard me. There isn't a demand that you can understand, that human beings can understand how God responds. That human beings can understand how God responds. So God is present as all these things. So in this way, we don't differ. I mean, there is no difference in how ordinary in traditional Islamic theology conceives of God. But I do want to say that in some ways, there may be a greater affinity with the Mu'tazili. I've never articulated this publicly, and I'm just thinking aloud as you're speaking now, because it was the Mu'tazili who centered in some ways the justice of God. Although justice in kalam is often understood as somewhat different from, say, the contemporary concepts of what justice is. So the centrality of God as just has been brought to the fore by the Mu'tazilis. And in this case, there may be an affinity with that aspect of things. But this is essentially the desperation of people who live on the margins. Where is God who is an-Nasir? Where is God who is the deliverer? Who is God? Where is God who is the helper and the victor? And the victory of God is not seen as the victory of, it's also seen as the vindication of the marginalized. That God listens to them, God responds to them. So in some ways, there are affinities. There's been no serious discussion on the nature of God in liberation theology circles, but there is an affinity with the idea that God responds and God listens, although we as human beings, we can't be the imposers of the manner and the how and the when of God's response.
Fantastic. Professor, we know that it's your iftar time. You've got to pray Maghrib. We don't want to
well, I still have a few minutes. I'm not sure.
Final thoughts before we close, or so final things. I mean, essentially, where do you like to see liberation theology? If you were to say, there's sort of fiqh, there's hadith, there's the sciences of X, Y, Z. Some of the things you're saying, but these issues have been since humanity. These issues have been there. Is there a need for theology? I mean, such a liberation theology in some sense.
Not only is there a need, but how in the midst of COVID-19 do you not respond and do you not say, Mata Nasrullah, where is the help of God coming from? I mean, this COVID thing, it's hitting all of us. If you look at the situation of Muslims in India, Hindu supremacy, it's hitting all of the Muslims. If you look at the millions of people, by the way, we're talking about COVID as a crisis, forget about COVID. If you look at the wars of invasion of the Muslim lands in the last 20 years or since 9/11, you have to ask, where is God in all of this?
But these questions were asked when the Mongols came, when the Crusaders came. So what's the value? What is it,
Absolutely. Absolutely. But this is a continuous thing. And God becomes present through our rebellion. God becomes present through our rejection of Taghut, our rejection of Fir'auniyat, and our struggling to become closer to him, even as we are engaging in this rejection on the one hand, never letting go. And of course, I mean, I've spoken about the Quran, your attachment to the Quran, but the Quran for Muslims is one manifestation of the presence of God. But the presence of God is, we're not worshipping a book. So there is a need.
So it's an attempt to do ijtihad, would you say? This is your attempt to do an ijtihad on the issue?
It's not, I don't, it is. I mean, there's an element of ijtihad involved in it. Right. But I've never separated myself from now to use these things, and the word in which Brother Saif had used it, the sense of the traditional ulama. I've never said that they're kind of I'm a new, I've never, to assume to myself the role of, say, I'm a somebody, or I'm a mujtahid. But yes, this is a kind of ijtihad, not a blanket, this thing, just ijtihad. but it is a reflection of the desperation for God to make sense of the struggles and the lives of the poor and the marginalized, not the poor, sorry, the impoverished.
So,
Because people become poor through systems of economic oppression.
fantastic. We got a comment saying, so question, could liberation theology be classified as a quasi-theodicy?
Well, I can see this, the shades of Hamid Dabashi looming over me. Yes, it can, I think. Yes, I think, yes, I would say yes, it can. What kind of theodicy? There are also different kinds of theodicies that one can think of. But yes, but I would not want to go along the path of, say, Hamid Dabashi in this particular, not at this late stage in our discussion.
And just as we come to the end, I know because of you have to pray Maghrib and so just, you have your connections back to your Dar Ulums in Pakistan. And when you go back and you connect with them and you talk about these issues, what are they saying? Because obviously Pakistan is a real hodgepodge, is a real center for liberation at the moment for the Muslim world, as we can see with the COVID experience by the great ulama. What are your thoughts? What are they saying when you talk about this?
Well, I don't speak about this when I go back to my Dar al-Ulum, which is more regularly than what people would imagine. When I go back, it's like, you go to your father's house or to your parents' house, and you moved away from them a long time ago, but you just sit and you listen and you are polite and you remember the love that they treated you with and what you benefited from them. You go in a different mode. So I don't go back there as an intellectual. I don't even think of myself as very intellectual. So I don't go there as anything except Farid, the Salik. And sometimes I go there in a bit of a mournful sense to look at what have I lost in the years that I spent there.
Right. And how about in South Africa? Have they picked up a lot of your, liberation theory, or the ulama al-haq, as they like to call themselves, still in the little ghettoized, world?
Look, I have good relationships with by far most of them, alhamdulillah. Many of the ulama, maulanas, muftis, they are students of mine. I'm not interested, in getting them to think along a particular line.
Right.
I'm also an academic. I'm also a teacher. So
no, but here's an example, because there's a question by Aisha Said from Pakistan. An example, practical response built on liberation theology in recent history. And I would say to someone who's followed your work for the last 25 years or so, as a result of the apartheid, and then the last 10 years, 15 years, we're seeing a lot of these traditional ulama go to Palestine. And they will not, and these are the same people who would have gone 25 years back on a dogmatic position. It's quite interesting how they've completely changed. But yeah, there's just, going on to Aisha's question, as an example response built on liberation, can you give an example of recent history? Any practical response built on liberation theology in recent history?
Well, I'm not into touting my own works. In fact, on the contrary, whenever anybody says that they've read a book that I've written, my first thought is, oh my gosh, why would you have wanted to read that book? But in this case, Aisha, there's one thing that I would want to refer you to. And this is an article by Laura McTighe, where she examines how in parts of the African American Muslim community, liberation theology was used to deal with the question of alcohol, drug abuse, and the systemic incarceration of Black people. It's a fascinating article contained in a book that I edited on Islam, HIV, and AIDS and AIDS, the pandemic, between scorn, pity, and justice. And I'd also like to suggest that my own book, the Quran, Liberation and Pluralism, it really deals with how the Quran spoke to Muslims who were living under apartheid and who were resisting oppression. So I would. Somebody asked me about the title of the book. I'm not sure which book it's now. But
I think it's the Liberation Theology in Black America.
Yeah, so that's the one, and the one is Islam, HIV, and AIDS. Islam, HIV, and AIDS. Yeah, so in both of these are reflected, but I also think that there are fascinating work happening in the south of India, and I see some of these people are online at the moment where they are rethinking how does Muslims from an Islamic perspective respond to the question of Hindu supremacy. So there are examples of activists, of people doing this kind of work in different parts of the world. But the most written about example, sadly, I mean, because in many ways, you know, people who engage in liberation theology, they don't write. We're not theorists. We're not really theologians. People are busy making history while others are busy writing about history. I mean, it's a bit unfortunate because I think that more theorizing needs to be done. More
It's work in progress.
More, yeah, absolutely.
Work in progress. Well, on that note, Professor, thank you so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I think most folks have had a thorough good session as well. They really enjoyed it. Please make dua for us. Remember us in our, you know, your duas. I know we've got loads of questions still coming through, but I think if you would like to continue with questions, please contact the professor directly. We'll send you his email on the chat. And inshallah, maybe would like to do a Zoom after Ramadan, maybe and work on some things with you in future as well.
I'd be happy to do so. Thank you very much, everybody, and forgive me for my own inadequacies and shortcomings, and have a blessed and useful Ramadan for what is left of it. Make the best of it, people. Will not come back to us.
Thank you very much. And a note to everyone, please leave your email addresses if you haven't registered. We'll send you a recording of the video and any notes that was accompanied with the presentation. So, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi.